Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. Recently, over the holiday period, I've played some games on chess.com with friends and colleagues in real life. The following video shows an analysis of 3 games I played against a friend who's really into chess at the moment and at an earlier stage of their journey. He hasn't any specific knowledge of opening theory, but rather plays intuitively from a sense of what moves feel right. I thought that these 3 consecutive games are interesting as they are quite varied and also show some concepts and principles that might be helpful for beginner intermediate players. Please enjoy! So let's start with game 1, just a very quick review. So this is according to chess.com's algorithm. Expectedly, I'm playing somewhat more accurately than my mate. I am higher rated, though, I certainly am not playing perfectly in these games. These were just largely friendly matches. And even though they were daily games, we played them fairly quickly. And I didn't put a huge amount of analysis before each move. Let's have a quick look now at the analysis. So I played e4 and my mate played a d5, the Scandinavian defense, which is potentially quite a good defense against e4. So I capture, which is pretty normal. Opponent captures back with queen, which is normal, and then knight c3, threatening the queen. And typically in this situation, the opponent has a number of places that they can place their queen. My mate here, however, undeveloped their queen back to d8, which is apparently a type of opening, but automatically, in my view, is probably not a good move. It's probably not the best way to play the Scandinavian, given that I'm now a full tempo ahead, effectively. We both have lost a pawn. For me, the king's pawn, then the queen's pawn. I'm not really sure that makes much of a difference, to be honest, but it now allows me to now effectively take control of the center with d4. So obviously that pawn is protected by the queen. My mate here now plays bishop f5, and I noticed that he does play bishop f5 or the sort of corresponding other bishop to the to that rank quite commonly. But of course, this actually doesn't work in this opening, because now that the e pawn is gone, I can respond simply with the pawn sort of g4, which directly attacks the bishop. That's supported by the queen, and so my opponent is now forced to move the bishop a second time, and all the while they are losing. Losing moves, basically. So they've basically only developed one piece, and now I've got 2 developed knights and 2 pawns. So this is a pretty big problem. And if you look at the Stockfish evaluation, effectively a full pawn ahead for white at this point already. e6, which is good. Here I decide to go a bit of entering, potential attack on the bishop, however, also placing pressure on that pawn as well. Here I play queen. Now, potential mate threat, obviously not while that bishop is there, but I've also got an attack along that diagonal. And the opponent, my mate, didn't seem to see that attack, which sort of allows for queen captures b7. To capture that knight, that's a fair trade, so I have no particular problems with that. Not entirely sure why my opponent decided to make that capture. Yep, sure, they could do that, but this does cause a problem for them because now I have a check, and that forces basically the king to move out of position, so giving up the right to castle. Now I've got bishop. Yep, that seems fairly reasonable. Now that sort of transformation doesn't make sense given the number of defenders on that square, but now I have another move, and that's potentially forcing, because if the opponent, if my mate doesn't do something about that, that's potentially a mate in one threat. queen there. Now, if you look at Stockfish, that was probably the better move because that queen previously also defended that rook by bringing queen d7. Yes, it protects against mate, and I suppose it's also threatening the queen, but clearly I'm not going to let that stand, and now there's basically a free rook. It captures the bishop, which I suppose makes sense. Now captures the pawn. Not entirely sure that that was the best move, but I suspect my mate here wasn't sure what to play, and certainly it's not the most obvious position here now either. Now a threat on the queen, probably moving my king, out of danger with short castles was the better move. I agree. Here, however, I was just venturing, creating threats. Slide their queen back. And now I've got an attack on the bishop. Basically, there is nowhere the bishop can potentially go that isn't going to result in it being captured. So in this square, that captures that square, that captures here, that captures here, that captures here, that captures here, that captures, and here that captures. So effectively, that bishop is lost, which in my view means it's probably important just to accept that it's lost and make another move. However, my mate here opts to move their bishop. However, that in a certain sense really only results in a loss of a turn, given that the bishop was going to be lost regardless of where it went. So capture with knight. The opponent brings their queen forward. However, that queen was previously defending that pawn, and now I've got a capture there with check. That would be now a forced move, given that these two squares are protected. So pretty much the king is forced to move to d8. Has no other options, and now checkmate. So, fairly quick game, and probably the difficulties really started from the opening with the choice of retreating the queen back to d8. Now let's move on to the next game. So game two. Game two was a very interesting game, I think. And as you see, my mate was way ahead at a certain point. I did not play this game very accurately, and you'll see there's a blunder there. And my mate actually made better moves, but I think the blunder I made wasn't punished, and the blunder he made was fairly critical, I think. So let's have a look at the analysis now. All right, so I played black in this game, and my mate opened with e4. I played e5, and we begun with the 4 knights. And my mate played the Gunsberg variation, which is actually a pretty interesting version of the 4 knights. When I look at sort of the chess.com master database, this is actually a very good opening for white. So in the masters games, white has a substantial lead over black in terms of the proportion likely to win over black, which is unusual for any sort of opening for white. So this is potentially a very, very good opening for white. Now in this game, I responded immediately with a5, which automatically is already bad, apparently. But my thinking here was that I didn't want an immediate queen side push, and by doing this it basically just blocks that from happening. So if they did try to play b4, captures, and they can't do that really because their rook would be hanging. So they bring bishop c4, I play bishop c5, and push knight g5. So not the most accurate move. Now I think we played this game reasonably late at night, and I think I just wasn't thinking clearly, and I thought, oh, hanging pawn, let's capture. And immediately after I made the move and said yes, I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's not hanging at all. But it is what it is. So I think I did short castles first. Yeah, that's right. He brings his knight out, and here I thought, oh, hanging hanging pawn because I thought, oh yes, guarded by the guard of that pawn by that knight has moved, but of course that pawn is actually now also guarded by that knight as well. So I capture, and that was just a straight out blunder. So, and I sort of noticed that blunder immediately after I moved, saw the knight. Oh, wait a minute. So it is what it is. So my opponent immediately played the right move, of course, captured back my knight with their knight. And here I decide to just go, look, I've probably just straight out lost this game. I thought, so let's just play creatively, aggressively. And so I immediately played Queen H4, which pretty much is a bluff. So, you know, looks like maybe, possibly, there's that there's some sort of mate threat there, but there isn't really because, you know, the pawn is guarded by the knight on e4. But it looks scary, maybe, but it's really a bluff. And I was pretty much asking them to call my bluff. You know, potentially, maybe that looks like it's a threat. Of course, that doesn't work. So it looks like I'm here attacking that pawn and also attacking that knight. And so from that perspective, I was wondering whether my mate would think, oh, you know, maybe I could just whack that bishop, take that knight out of line of attack, and also completely remove the possibility of that mate in one threat attacking that weak f pawn. And now this is a sort of supposition on my part, but that's actually what my mate did. So so knight captures bishop. However, that's an error. So the best move by far is playing d3. d3, the pawn protects both the knight and the bishop. And as mentioned before, there is no real attack there. That's completely a bluff because it's defended by the knight. However, by knight captures bishop, I now capture the bishop back. And as you can see, chess.com thought the algorithm thought that was a great move. And basically, I've equalized. But more than that, my queen is now roaming around the board, you know, attacking two different pieces. So this is potentially dangerous territory for my opponent. That capture was not a good move. So immediately you see that black is substantially ahead now. So obviously can capture back with knight. And the challenge, of course, here is now I've got queen with check. Block with queen, there's no reason for me to trade to capture that pawn. And at this point, rather than, I saw that I could potentially come back here, but we'll just end up shuffling moves. I thought this would be a good time, given that I'm ahead on material, to liquidate. So to liquidate pieces, and that's what I do. So queen catches queen, rook captures, meaning, of course, there is no castling on that side now. And with being a piece ahead, better development, better pawn structure, I was fairly confident as long as I play accurately from this point, don't blunder anything, I should be doing okay. So d6, establishing sort of my pawn chain. Pretty good move, I thought, you know, the f4, so striking out. And here I thought a little while before making a move. You know, obviously there's some trappiness here. And I decided to defend that pawn with f6. So apparently playing bishop f5 was the better move. Captures, happy to capture back. Now the rooks look at each other, trade. Again, I'm happy, generally happy to capture pieces. This bishop and this rook are sort of fairly weak at the moment. While I have got an open diagonal for my bishop, this rook, I suppose, is not really in the game much at the moment. Knight f2, that seems okay. I now bring out my bishop to f5. Yep, opening the diagonal for the bishop, d3, that's good. I now bring out my knight, so, you know, potentially, fighting for that square. Their bishop comes out to e3. All of this makes sense. So my opponent's playing well at the moment. d5, so I'm potentially trying to really push into that territory. Well, for both the center squares, potentially. Long castles, and now I strike out with that pawn. So Stockfish doesn't like that, but I thought it was okay. The likelihood that that they would actually capture, I thought that wasn't high, and they didn't. I was fairly sure that was probably the best move for my opponent, but I suspected that my mate wasn't going to make that move. Yep, now knight behind, and I was wondering whether or not I could turn that pawn into a passed pawn, which would make it much, much stronger. Aha, and then it happened. So looking to capture that pawn, I don't mind, because now push the pawn to e3, it's a passed pawn. Now my opponent really, really needs to focus now on this pawn. If I lost that pawn, what does it matter? Not really very much, to be honest. Well, this pawn is now suddenly a real player in the game. So knight h1, which is the best move for white, but from my perspective, it locks that knight into the corner. It's not a particularly good place for a knight. Forward again. Yep, defending, blocking with the rook seems to make sense. But now I can bring my my knight into the game here with an attack. I thought this was pretty unstoppable. Yep, don't care about that. This is the most important piece as far as I'm concerned at the moment. So capture. And here, again, I thought they made a move. It was probably was better sense for them to capture that pawn, because that pawn is basically a queen. It's one step away from queen. That bishop will always remain a bishop. And here I make the last move, and my mate resigns. And after I made a move, I saw actually that would have been the better move. So knight captures pawn, comes with check, which basically means the my opponent would must make a move, and that allows for promotion. While otherwise the bishop could capture that pawn, sacrificing itself when it becomes queen. But with that move, the queen is unavoidable. Nonetheless, that was the end of the second game. Now let's move on to game 3. So game 3, very quick review. So I'd started off very well, and then I make a pretty egregious blunder, which basically leads me to completely lose all my advantage. And through some luck, I was able to sort of claw my way back and win the game. So again, we both make some good moves, and we both make some inaccuracies. So certainly I'm not playing perfectly in these games either. So on to analysis. I played white, so e4, e5, knight c3, knight c3 to the beginning of the Vienna. My mate plays knight f6, inviting the Vienna Gambit. So I think by this point, because I think I have played the Vienna Gambit against my mate before, you realized that accepting the Gambit is bad. So accepting the Vienna Gambit is just bad, because if you accept the Gambit, next move is e5. It's just bad for black, absolutely terrible for black. However, I think my mate didn't quite know how to decline the gambit. So there's only one good way to decline the gambit, which is immediately with d5. So basically fighting for the center. My mate played bishop d6, which seems a very logical sort of move. Defending defending that pawn. However, it doesn't work, and Stockfish reckons it's a straight out blunder. And basically, this is why. In this case, I can simply capture the pawn, and now it forks the bishop and knight. Now, ostensibly, it looks like that seems like it's okay because a bishop can capture back, but it just now leads to another move, d4, and now again attacking the bishop. Bishop is forced to move, or accept being lost, which doesn't seem to make any sense. So they capture back, but now queen captures. So basically, trading a bishop for a pawn. So that's an excellent trade. So already almost +5 by move 6. So very, very much a winning position for white. So you simply cannot decline the Vienna Gambit with the bishop in that way. So d6, that makes sense. So potentially preventing e5. Here I played bishop g5, potentially pinning the knight to the queen. Opponent develops knight d7, so knight bd7. I now, because that knight is pinned, I bring out my other knight, so potentially to to be able to force a capture. Knight e5, okay, probably not quite the best move. I do long castles. No, bringing forward c5 as an attack on the queen. Yep, so not a bad move, but gradually the advantage is slipping further and further towards white. So here I can capture and now inviting a potential trade in queens. So being up in material means I am willing to potentially give up some material to create some threats. They capture bishop back. Now obviously I should move the queen out of the way. However, before I did that, I thought let's slip out. Let's try to trade more pieces. Can we trade more pieces? So bishop b5 with check. That's what was I expected. Here I opted to move the queen to a4. And I would prefer the trade in this direction for their bishop to capture mine. They sort of long castle, short castles, which again wasn't the best move, though very understandable. So moving the king out of danger. I now bring my rook f1 with sort of potential 2 pieces attacking that pawn. They captured bishop. I capture back. Knight comes back to d7 as a defender, which makes sense, I suppose. And here I captured the pawn on b7. Now the strategy which I missed here, and I actually did not see the strategy until I analysed the game, an absolutely savage line potentially, which actually remained possible for quite a few moves, was to straight out capture the knight with queen. That looks like, well, what's going on there, because queen captures queen. But now I've got a fork of the king and queen. King is forced to move somewhere, let's say there, and then I win the queen back. So that was the best line, which I didn't see. It's always interesting when I sort of go back in to do the analysis. All these sort of moves that the computer sees, Stockfish sees very easily. And instead, I captured the pawn on b7. Now, if the opponent doesn't do something about that position, for example, moving the king out of line where it could be checked, can be put into check, then it's still possible. So in fact, my next best move, which I didn't make, was still queen captures knight. And again, if I did queen captures knight and queen captures back, in fact, I would have what we call a family fork, where the knight forks the king, the queen, and the rook. Didn't see that though. Instead, I thought I was very clever by playing the knight to c7 with a fork of the 2 rooks. So that was a fine move, but definitely not as powerful as the other move, but partly because the opponent can simply sidestep that by moving the rook to b8, now with a threat of the queen. So pretty much the only thing I can do here is win the other pawn. Knight captures, that's a good move. And here I don't think I make quite the best move. I bring my knight out to connect the rooks. Very, very good move, lining it up as a battery here. And here I make another mistake. So here I decided to fork, but that was a blunder. I lose all my advantage here. And the reason for that is the opponent can now basically trap my queen. And that's always a problem whenever your queen is in enemy territory, where it's kind of by itself, not a lot of room to move, surrounded by so powerful pieces. The queen is liable to getting trapped. Now, luckily, my mate didn't see that trap, moved sort of a rook to a8. I had convinced myself that I had basically lost that queen, which I hadn't actually at this point, because I could move queen here, basically forcing a queen trade, which is still fine, basically. I'd convinced myself I lost a queen. So basically, I decided, look, what I'll do is I'll trade the queen for the 2 rooks. So queen worth about 9 points. The rook's worth 5 points each. So ostensibly it's a fair trade, though towards the end game, I would argue that queen is probably stronger than 2 rooks. So rooks without having any diagonal movement does make it more challenging to win in the end game. However, so queen captures queen, I captured the other rook, and now I'll sort of lose that knight as well. So here we're almost equal. So queen and knight versus 2 rooks and knight. So it's a fairly even game. I move my, so obviously need to defend my pawns, which are defending my king. So centralize so the king there to b1. Knight comes forward. I now bring rook d1, attacking that pawn. Pawn moves forward. Yeah, I can see where that's going there. Again, now sort of again threatening with the rook on both pawns. Opponent brings queen as a defender of the pawn. Makes a lot of sense. I now bring my other rook. So the idea is I'm going to form a battery. So that should allow me to capture that pawn, because obviously the opponent cannot afford to lose their queen. Push forward again. I couldn't really see that as a problem for me. That looked like actually probably a mistake or a blunder when I saw it, because I could capture back. They can't really capture back unless they want to lose their knight for a pawn. So captures. They did capture, and that was clearly a mistake, because I think in the end game, 2 rooks and a knight is almost certainly, I think, stronger than just 1 queen. So they can capture that. Capture the, now capture the pawn, move forward. I suppose that makes sense. Check. Putting a threat on that pawn again. Now that ends up being a fairly big blunder. I would agree it's not very obvious why that's a blunder, but I could see a potential trap. So with the rook now on the 8th rank, it's basically as if the 8th rank doesn't exist. It's almost like this is now the edge of the board for the opponent's king, because the king cannot move to any of these squares. With the pawns in that position, it means that the king has, if they have to escape, must go to one of these 3 squares. And that is potentially very powerful. So what I did was, I move the knight to d4, threatening that pawn. Opponent naturally moves the pawn out of the way because they don't want to lose another pawn. But you can see that was not the correct move. Substantial worsening of the position. The best move would have been to move this pawn, so now that the king has an extra escape square. Because now what happens is that is now check. King, as I said, cannot move back to the 8th rank, must move forward to one of these 3 squares. It doesn't matter which one, because now that is a fork with the rook of the queen and the king. Doesn't matter what the king does, this queen is now lost. So captures, and my mate opted to resign at this point. Obviously, they had no pieces left. And so this is some of the trickiness, particularly with knights, and some of the power potentially with having 2 pieces, so the rooks versus just a queen, especially when there are still pieces left, when there are pawns and things left on the board, because these can sometimes end up geometrically, so block the king into particular positions. Anyway, great games. GG to my mate. So, some tips and insights from these 3 games. Firstly, it is helpful to know a little opening theory, especially the first few moves of the common openings, or at least the openings you play. In the first game, the Scandinavian Defense is a good response to e4, but underdeveloping the queen to d8 on move 3 is bad, as white is now straight up a full tempo up on development. Similarly, in the third game, Bishop d6 to decline the Vienna Gambit is a straight-up blunder. The best response is d5, which enters the Vienna Game main line. Secondly, it's important to look at the pieces that can capture along the diagonals, the queen and bishops. It's common to potentially miss threats along the diagonals, especially from afar. Thirdly, before you commit to a move, consider how the opponent is likely to respond. Do you end up hanging a piece? Do you need to trade pieces, or is it better to keep the tension? And lastly, keep an eye out for potentially forcing moves, both those you have against your opponent and those your opponent has against you. These include checks and checkmates, and forks and pins, especially those against your valuable pieces. And valuable pieces aren't just the queen and rooks. If you're down on material, keeping to remain a minor piece or your pawns might be vital. A pawn that's approaching promotion might indeed be your most valuable piece other than the king. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.